tools. We've got tons of tools for a variety of different tasks here at the reserve. And so I'm just going to go through one by one and kind of chat about what they're all about, why we use them, what they're called, and hopefully you'll be able to take away something from this and maybe in the future know what to use when you're out in the field. So first things we're going to start with right here, gloves. We provide gloves for all of our interns. Try and wash them every so often, pretty regularly. If they're not really soiled, we'll try and reuse them. But everybody gets a pair of gloves. Super important. Just keeping hands clean. Sometimes we're working in mud and stuff like that, pulling plants that have a bunch of stickers in them. So kind of keeping our hands in good shape is the name of the game. So we've got a couple different types of gloves. These are some. Moving into our basic hand tools for restoration work. So kind of the name of the game once we're done planting is weeding. So we've got a few different tools for weeding. And our main one is just this little kind of pick, broad fork type thing. So it's got one end, which is kind of a little blade end, and then this is for kind of breaking up clumps of soil. And these things are great. When you're trying to pull up some plant that has a big taproot, this is really what you want. This tool does do a lot of damage to kind of the surrounding soil. So especially when we're weeding smaller plants in early season when our paper is still intact from our restoration work, then we actually want to use something like this. So this is just like this little tined, kind of really simple fork, and you can basically just get it under a root or attached to a root and pry the plant up, and it does really minimal damage to the surrounding soil and paper if it's still there. So depending on what stage in that year's restoration work we're in, early in the season we'll use one of these guys, and then later in the season we'll use something like this. This is called a hori hori. Nate's going to give you more info about that.
What's up, you guys? Today I'm going to be showing you about my favorite tool and the one I just convinced Vaughn to get. The hori hori. It's pretty great for a lot of the weeding work that we've been doing recently. It's basically this dagger for weeds. It's got this serrated edge, which makes it really great for cutting through roots as well as through jute, which is what we had mulched part of our plot with this year. It's also got a non-serrated edge that's pretty sharp, but less likely to cut you than this side. It's got these sweet centimeter and inch markings, or millimeter and inches, which is really nice if you're trying to judge the size of certain plants or just take some pictures with a reference. It's really just kind of good to have around if you're just pulling invasive weeds.
One of our most used tools is this thing. It's called a dibbler, and it's basically the exact size of our cones that we use for planting. I'm going to go find one of those. Okay, here's a cone. So these guys, all of our plants get grown in these, and it's basically the exact same size, right? So basically what you do, stab this into the ground. It has this little foot peg, so you can actually kind of press with your foot, sink it down into the soil up to there, and then you can basically pull your plant out and it will fit perfectly. These guys, they're pretty heavy. They've got a lot of weight at the bottom, and it just makes restoration planting a breeze. So that's one of the reasons why we plant out in these guys. If we were to grow plants in larger containers, then you're moving into having to use a shovel, right? Which is not as easy, especially when you're dealing with potentially hard soil later in the season. So like April, when it's hasn't rained maybe as much as it did in February. Digging holes to put gallon plants in the ground is not fun. Laying out mulch. So we have a bunch of wheelbarrows, and we'll basically pile mulch in these wheelbarrows using these pitchforks. You'd think maybe, typically when you're like digging up soil to put in a wheelbarrow or something like that, using a shovel is the way to go. This actually, because of like kind of the size and shape of the mulch, this actually can pick up mulch really quickly and easily, and a lot of it. So a bunch of pitchforks and just pitchforking like you're pitchforking straw into the wheelbarrow. Great tool. It's the only time we ever use them. We've got a bunch of rakes. So it's kind of a flat rake. We've got bow rakes in there, different style, but these are really useful sometimes after you lay out mulch on paper to just push things around, right? It's also good for trail work, so we'll use these then. Okay, to kind of finalize some of our restoration stuff. This is inverted marking chalk. So it's paint that you can spray when it's upside down. So unlike regular spray paint where it has to be upright, this you can put in a little like a little rolling spray gun kind of thing and spray it upside down. So when I have basically planned out all of where the plants are going to go, that happens in the summer. And then we start planting, we can use a GPS device like an iPad and go around with that and actually delineate where we're planting each thing and write what the species is going to be on there. So really, really helpful. It's better than like laying out flags or marking tape, flagging tape, that kind of thing. And this just goes away. I don't know if it's water soluble or what, but we're basically spraying it right on the mulch, and the mulch is breaking down. So really, really handy technique for laying out your site. A couple other things. So sometimes when we're working adjacent to some scrub areas, we're dealing with herbivores. And the main herbivore that there's problems with is the brush rabbit. So rabbits come in and they just start munching on our plants and basically just slow down growth. They'll chew them right down to the roots. So we put some fencing in sometimes. This is a T-post pounder. So T-post, fence post, this thing will slide over it and then you can pound it into the ground. It's really heavy, weighs a lot, and it's kind of the only way, unless you have like a backhoe, to actually get T-posts into the ground. So super handy tool. And then that kind of leads us to what happens when you're done with that fencing and want to pull those T-posts out. Don't have a backhoe? T-post puller. So this thing basically sits on the ground, pull this up, leverage it onto the post, and then you can pry it out of the ground. It's amazing, these little things, like pulling T-posts out of the ground. You actually need a specialized tool to do it, or you're digging it out with a shovel. Nobody wants to do that. So, super handy tool, and we don't use it a lot, but when we do need it, we really need it. Okay, that kind of wraps up restoration tools for the most part. We're going to jump into the smaller little toolbox and talk about some watering things, that kind of thing, but I'm going to move on to more trail work, kind of maintenance, the maintenance side of all the restoration work we do. So we have a few trails around and they need to be maintained. These native plants, once they get established, especially the scrub plants, they go gangbusters. They start growing like crazy. They'll easily grow over a trail. So we got a few tools, hand tools, some shears. These are decent. but basically like pruning shears, for your trimming the hedge at your house. And when these don't have enough leverage, then you can move on to these. These are like pruning shears, right? So these are for getting larger diameter twigs and stems. Other things, obviously shovels and rakes, really handy for trail work. But then there's cool things like this McLeod, which is called a McLeod hoe rake. And these are really, they're really popular for wildland firefighters, actually. So you can pull brush, you can stamp things out, you can dig with these. It's really just a multi-tool. So this is a really handy item that we only have one of these, but I don't actually know how much it gets used. We just used it for building some new trail. So really handy. That's a McLeod. This is called a hula hoe, and it's basically just lets you kind of get under the stems of plants and kind of get down under the soil a little bit, and you basically can either pull the plant up by the roots or just chop it right at the base of the ground. So it's good when these are sharp. This thing looks pretty worked over. It's all messed up, but basically want to keep these decently sharp, flat, and you can just kind of go to town and just kind of almost rake back and forth and take out a bunch of weed plants. Hula hoes, we've got a bunch of those, and they are awesome. This is called a broad fork, and this is our newest acquisition here at the reserve. It's for dealing with these rhizomatous, weedy plants that we're trying to get out of the ground. Has kind of two uses. So that pulling, like basically breaking up the soil. So you put it wherever you want it, and then you basically push it into the ground, wiggle it back and forth. Those tines go all the way into the ground, and then you have all this leverage to use your body weight to basically rip the soil up. So this is really handy, not only when you're trying to get rid of weedy species that might have a bunch of roots, a root system underground, like a rhizomatous plant, but also really good when you have extremely compacted soil. So a lot of these plant species, they're not adapted for these compacted soils that you might encounter on like old roadbeds, even old farmland, right? So this is really handy when you've got that compacted soil to basically aerate it. You're trying to break up the soil so you have places for the native plant, their roots to go. So it's an amazing tool. It's always good to support companies that are making things in the USA, so this one's one of them. Super handy. Let's see, a couple other kind of maintenance tools. This is a machete, so kind of a small one. And these, you really have to be careful with these things. It's basically a little sword. So you got to make sure there's kind of a few things that you want to be remembering when you're using one of these. Is you don't want to be chopping down really thick stemmed plants. These are really designed for vines and grasses in like South America and Central America, right? They're not for chopping down willows necessarily. So you got to be really careful when you're using them. Make sure that they are sharp. It's kind of counterintuitive. You'd think maybe a dull machete would be a little bit safer. But a dull machete is a machete that doesn't actually chop through what you're trying to chop through and might ricochet back and fly out of your hand, something like that. So really important to make sure that they are sharp, and then know that they're sharp, and be aware of who's around you when you're using them. So you don't want to necessarily have someone right behind you when you're swinging a machete, or to the side. You want to know where everyone is and be really aware of it. So yeah, that's that tool. It's incredibly useful when you're using it properly. And then just getting a little smaller, just some hand shears. These are great, especially for when we're gathering vegetation to propagate. So that vegetative propagation, so gathering stems, this is really where it's at. Also, just doing little pruning. Like we have some buckeye California buckeye that's next to the trail, one of our trails. And if you don't prune these trees properly, they just become kind of a matted mess. So for a while, maybe the last year, we've just been trying to just get through it. Haven't been really pruning it very well, and it's become this kind of twisted, gnarled mess. And the result, the tree isn't growing very well. So, once you start managing a plant, kind of got to do it in a good way, or else the plant's going to react in a weird way. This isn't like California buckeye isn't used to being pruned. So I don't know if any plant really is. But anyways, having good technique when you're pruning is integral, and a good pair of hand pruners is really useful when you're doing that. Okay, I think I touched on all the hand tools. We're going to now move into tools that use fossil fuels. Here we have all of our orange tools that make a lot of noise and burn fossil fuels, but they are so helpful and so useful. Start with this guy since we were talking about kind of trail maintenance. This is a hedger. So they all have guards over them to protect the blades, mainly from you. These things are all really sharp, and so this is basically just a gas-powered machete. So be kind of tricky to start, but this thing basically goes back and forth, really sharp little teeth on there, and for smaller things, it will just cut back little branches along a trail. So keeping trails maintained with this saves a ton of time. Next thing we've got, and you might think that these are really similar, but they actually they kind of both fill a little niche. It's a chainsaw, relatively small. Again, it's got a guard over it. But sometimes we're having to clear larger, like some trees that aren't native that have grown up, things like that. So, this thing can tackle what this guy won't. You can cut down a tree with a chainsaw. So, really handy. It's good to wear the proper PPE, protective gear, when you're using one of these. So a lot of times that means a helmet, ear pro, glasses for your for your eyes. Usually something to cover your face. So if there's chunks of wood that are coming at you, that you're not getting hurt. Usually some sort of covering, and a lot of times that's something that's over your legs. So something like Kevlar or some sort of really highly protective pant coverings, so you're not going to saw through your leg on accident. Again, with all these things, you want to be wearing really good shoes, pants, and usually like long sleeve shirts and gloves. So that's a chainsaw. And then kind of our tool that gets used the most that has a gasoline engine is our weed whippers. So we have a couple of these guys, and they get used at every restoration site that we go to. So it's kind of the first thing that we'll do to prep a site is come in with a weed whipper and mow everything right down to the ground. So we can start, when we're laying down that paper and mulch, start with a clean slate. So usually we're laying this stuff down in the beginning of the season, but still there's plant material from last year. You don't want things poking through the paper, so weed whipping it right to the ground, really useful. These guys, you have to actually wear a harness, and then the weed whipper actually just sits on the harness, and you just kind of hold these handles, which makes, when you're weed whipping for a long time, a large area, this makes it really doable.
It's definitely really important to get the bottom of the plant, like the roots, especially where it looks like it's growing new plant tissue. If you leave any of that behind, you're pretty much going to be left with the weed coming back regardless of if you had pulled the top or not. So definitely want to get in there, get deep at first, and then kind of just wiggle it to break the roots. and that's it. As you'll see in this video, other instruments are kind of more blunt force and a little less precise. So the hori hori is really nice because you can get up close to some of these native plants like this Baccharis glutinosa and pull out this radish without really damaging the root system. Serrated edge, and it's gone. A little bit of Italian wild rye. Just a little bit of root messing up, and for the most part, pretty good, clean plant. So right here, got this radish, and it's a pretty decent amount away from this epilobium. So pretty much just want to come in here, hit at the bottom, and pry up. Sometimes it takes a couple swings, but it's pretty effective. Got most of the root out, and yeah. It's definitely a good way to go.